Hello and welcome to End Zone Focus. I'm Davina William. Our special guest this week has built up a sound political career in New Zealand and has just embarked on the next stage as this country's High Commissioner in London. As well as a new job, Dr. Lockwood Smith now also has a new title, as this week he was knighted in the Queen's Birthday Honours List, becoming Sir Lockwood Smith. Allan Lee interviewed Sir Lockwood just before he flew out to London, and Allan, I understand we were really fortunate to have any time with him at all.
We were. It was a very busy time for him. He was literally in the last stages of packing up, so he found a corner for us to set up our camera, which wasn't covered in packing cases. But he's very well known in that area, in the Rawene district where his farm is. He's been a farmer there for many years, and of course his constituency was Rodney, where he was very popular and very well known and very visible. And of course most recently he's been the Speaker of the House, where he ran, I think it's fair to say, a tight but fair ship, where people just couldn't get away with dodging questions. He would insist on an answer. So I was delighted that he made time for us to chat before he left for London. Well, Dr. Smith, thank you for sparing time for us in the middle of packing to go to London. Are you looking forward to being our man in London?
I think at the moment there's probably a bit much panic going on here. I've got to get my farm organised so that I can handle it online from London, and getting packed up to, our packers arrive in just a couple of days' time, and so there's an awful lot of work to be done. I've just finished 3 weeks induction program in Wellington, and so I'd say it's all been too frantic to really be looking forward to it, but it'll be an honour to be New Zealand's High Commissioner in London.
Something of a Renaissance man, because you've been a teacher, you've got a PhD, you've been a television presenter, you've been an MP, you've been a speaker, now you're going to be our ambassador. Did you set out to do any of those things?
Originally when I was young I was going to be a scientist. Growing up on the farm here, I grew up in the old part of this house, and I always wanted to be an agricultural scientist. But it was while I was doing my PhD I decided, and towards the end of my years at university, that I maybe would want to get into politics. I wasn't good at locking myself in the laboratory for weeks on end as a scientist has to. And so I set about working out how to have a political career. And when I finished my PhD, one of the reasons why I went into international marketing then was to bring some real value to Parliament. I say to young people now, because I often talk about leadership with young people, that if you're thinking of a political career, make sure you bring some value to Parliament. We're seeing a few too many at the moment young people study political science at university, get a job in a party research unit at Parliament or a minister's office, get on a party list and they're in Parliament without ever having a job in the wider world. And when I was looking at politics, I felt I had a good academic background, I had a practical farming background. I used to run my father's Romney stud here from the age of 11. And so what I needed though was some hard international business experience, and that's why I joined New Zealand Dairy Board. Probably influenced me a little bit to get into television, to dabble in television a bit, because back in those days not many people felt comfortable on television. I wanted to feel comfortable on it. And set about planning to stand for Parliament. When I nominated for Kaipara, of course, it was a huge selection. Second biggest in the National Party's history. Half the hierarchy of the National Party lined up for Kaipara. You know, the chair of the Auckland region, Winston Peters, a former member of Parliament, the chair of the electorate, the chair of the neighbouring electorate, 2 board members of the National Party lined up for it. I'd only been a member for 3 years of the National Party. So it was quite a challenge to win it, but once I got into the final 5, I was reasonably confident I could win it.
It's interesting that I'm talking to you now and seeing your lovely house and the fantastic views across Kaipara. You feel very much like you're a Kaipara man who happened to be a politician in Wellington. Is that the way it is?
It is really. You know, I have loved Australia. When I was doing a PhD, I was on television there. I was having a lot of fun. I was captain of the Adelaide University Boat Club. I was rowing at the top level, Australian rowing. I was having a wonderful time. But I love the land here, and it's that love of the land that brought me back here to the Kaipara. I guess I've been involved in farming this land all my life, and that's really what brought me home. And I'm pleased I did. You know, I still love it here.
Your father built the older part of the house, and you built the new bit on. Do you think the fact that that you are so grounded in a community and you're part of this countryside. Do you think that makes you different as a politician to maybe the ones who are much more citified?
I think probably over the years it has. I've always been believed, instead of going around and shaking hands and saying, hi, I'm Lockwood Smith, your local MP, I've always got involved in community things. One of the reasons why I've shown my cattle around the region from Hamilton, I was at New Zealand Royal in Hamilton the end of last year, up to Whangarei, is that people love seeing a Member of Parliament doing real things, being actually involved in their real community. And AMP shows in rural New Zealand are quite a feature of our communities. And so I think people have liked that. I've put on concerts, I sing a bit, and I've put on concerts for the old folk in Rodney, and so tried to get involved in doing community things. And I think that has made me a little different as a Member of Parliament. I suspect there have been people who've perhaps voted for me in Rodney who've not always voted national. And I think it's partly because I've tried to make myself a genuine part of the community.
It's interesting you talk about an MP's responsibility and accountability. You said an interesting thing in your valedictory speech about how in your very early days as an MP, you had voted the way you thought your electorate would want you to vote rather than the way your heart was telling you to vote, and you regretted that.
That's the classic dilemma that a Member of Parliament faces on what we call the conscience issues, if you like, where the political parties aren't involved. And at the same time I said I think Edmund Burke was right. He was a politician in Britain a few hundred years ago now, a couple hundred years ago, who said that you owe your constituents your judgment, and that if you sacrifice your judgment to their opinion, you do them, I can't remember his actual words now, but you do them no favours at all. Just recently I gave a lecture at Victoria University in Wellington there, quite a major lecture on the issue of accountability of Members of Parliament. Because while I believe on some of those conscience issues, members should exercise their judgment, they are ultimately accountable to those who elect them. So if those who elect them don't like the way they've exercised that judgment, they can vote them out. I think we do have a problem, though, at the moment with Members of Parliament being almost totally accountable to their political parties rather than accountable to a constituency. And because even if their constituency votes them out at the moment, they can come back in off the party list. It's almost a rescue parachute, if you like, for failed constituency members. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think the public's quite disillusioned with that, I think it's fair to say. And to me, in all my experience in governance, getting accountability in the right place is so important. And I just think at the moment, our Members of Parliament are too accountable to political parties and not sufficiently accountable to local constituencies. And one day, I think we're going to have to readdress that.
So is this a case, do you think, of maybe having fewer list MPs and more constituency MPs, adjusting the balance?
I wouldn't like to argue exactly how it should be done, but the problem is the party vote applying to the whole Parliament. What we've sought to do with MMP is get a perfect proportional representation, or as near as possible to perfect proportional representation. And I don't think that's workable, because in doing that we've compromised accountability totally. And what I would argue is we need to find a balance between proportionality in terms of representation and accountability of members, getting more balance in that accountability back towards local constituencies. Now I think you're right, one way of achieving that would be to have more of the House occupied by constituency members, but you're not going to achieve that while the party vote applies to the whole Parliament. I think many New Zealanders, when they voted in MMP originally, thought they were actually voting for supplementary member. I think they actually thought they were voting for a system whereby they elected a constituency member and then they had a party vote to elect people off a list. And I don't think they realised that in fact their constituency vote makes no difference to how many seats a party has in Parliament. Only the party vote matters really. And that's why members are so accountable, even constituency members are so accountable to their parties.
One of the things that, as Speaker of the House, one of the things that you did was actually make MPs more accountable to the House. You wanted to see them there answering questions, not just giving a written answer.
I think that's true, that for some years it had troubled me watching ministers putting more effort, if you like, into avoiding answering a question than actually answering it. And one of the key, Parliament has two key roles in my view. One is the legislative role, and the other is where the executive or the government is held to account by the members of the House, if you like. And question time is a crucially important part of that, holding the government to account, where you can ask ministers, why have they spending money there? Why have they decided to do that? Why haven't they done this? When did they decide to do that? And all that sort of thing. And it's too important for it to just be a farce. And it had become a farce. And so I made it clear that if I was to be Speaker, things were going to change. I'm not sure ministers realised initially just how much I intended to change it, because I developed a practice where ministers were asked straight questions. I expected, or the House deserved an answer. And if I didn't hear an answer to a straight question, I'd go back to the minister and say the House deserves an answer. It's a straight question. Now, if members asked a politically loaded question, well, sure, ministers are free then to give a political answer back. And don't seek the Speaker's help if the member doesn't like the answer. But where straight questions are asked, I believe Parliament is so important that the public deserves an answer.
Did that make you very popular with some of your colleagues?
Interestingly, my colleagues, I give them great credit. They didn't try to argue with me. You know, I give huge credit to the Prime Minister. Not once did John Key ever say, Lockwood, look, I don't like the way you're doing this, I think you're too tough. Never. He never ever tried to influence the way I chaired the House as Speaker or any of the decisions I made as Speaker, and I have huge admiration for that. It shows how wise the Prime Minister is in terms of the balance of things there. And even he accepted at times, I'd sit him down or tell him he hadn't answered a question, he accepted that in good grace. And the ministers did, they stepped up to the plate, and where they heard straight questions, after a while they tended to just answer them. And one of the good things was, I heard later on, was when officials were briefing ministers getting ready for question time, and a minister would say to their officials, that's not enough, Lockwood won't accept that, I've got to have more information. Now that's not a bad thing, where officials know they've got to provide better information to their ministers to actually answer questions.
There were times that when you were sitting in that chair, when it did look like you were trying to hold a tiger by the tail, because you would have had Winston Peters being quite provocative and people losing their tempers. How do you keep so many articulate, noisy people under control?
I think I can only think of a couple of days where, there was one day in particular where it got untidy and I had to evict a couple of members, because I only evicted 4 members in 4 years, which is something of a record for, I don't think any speakers thrown fewer members out of Parliament. But I think what I tried to do is treat all members with respect. And if you treat members with respect, they tend to be more respectful back. And also, I think to try and have a reasonable sense of humour, that while the place is serious, it can't always be deadly serious or boring. It's got to be a little bit interesting. And so I tried to always keep it reasonably good-humoured and accept when I'm wrong. I think it's really important for a speaker to acknowledge they're not always right, and to apologise to the House, as I often did, if I felt I'd been wrong on something.
There were a couple of times I remember watching you, and there would have been a fairly spirited discussion going on, and the camera would cut back to you, and you had a little half smile of almost satisfaction on your face. Was that a case of hey, this is going really well, we're getting somewhere?
I think at times, members of the public watching Question Time, I think, used to quite enjoy my body language sometimes, because especially my face, I guess I've got a fairly expressive face, and you could usually tell what I was thinking of an answer by when the camera cuts my face. You could see whether I thought ministers were giving appropriate answers or not. And the public kind of enjoyed that. It's been amazing, the reaction from the public about how much they've actually enjoyed watching Question Time again, because for a while there they'd turned off it totally. And it's great to see them back watching it again.
Let's talk about some of the things that you achieved as an MP and as a minister. You were very involved with APEC and moving us towards more free trade agreements. Why do you think those are important?
I think a little economy like New Zealand, a small economy like New Zealand, we can't grow unless we trade with the world. It's through trading with the world that we can raise our standard of living. And I guess, as I said in my valedictory, when I entered Parliament, it was only 11 years after Britain had joined the EEC, and for a while there we were Britain's market garden, if you like, or big farm. And when Britain joined the EEC, we couldn't grow, we couldn't export more product to Europe. And so we had to develop markets elsewhere in the world, because not only could we not export more product to Europe, we couldn't export our stuff to the other developed economies, Japan, United States. The tariffs were over 100% often on our products, several 100%. And so we had to start moving our products into developing economies in Asia, Latin America. And so I was involved in that when I was working with the New Zealand Dairy Board prior to entering Parliament, and therefore I'd seen the challenge we were facing, and I guess one of the things I wanted to be when I entered Parliament one day was to be Trade Minister, see if I could do something towards liberalising trade. And I was lucky, I ended up Trade Minister, and at a time when we chaired APEC, I was able to chair one of the, not just APEC, but one of the main working groups of the World Trade Organization, and had some impact. I was the first trade minister in the world to sign China up to the World Trade Organization. They've never forgotten that, and that's one of the reasons why they were prepared to do a free trade agreement with New Zealand. I started the little trade agreement with Singapore, which has led on to what we now call the Trans-Pacific Partnership being negotiated at the moment. It was always a strategic deal. It was never any trade benefit in doing a trade deal with Singapore. The whole idea was strategic, develop a way of develop a 21st century trade agreement model, if you like, that other countries could then join in. And so I was very lucky to be involved at a time when we could really do things, and I'm quite proud we did do things.
There are people who have worries about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that we will be swamped by the big economies, that the American economy, which is so big that we'll just, they'll make it work for them, which may not work for us. I've heard American economists say that we will be swamped by them.
Markets don't work the way some of those people say. People have certain demands for products, and the risk of being swamped doesn't exist. I mean, one of the classic stories in New Zealand trade liberalisation is our wine industry. Way back in the mid-80s, it was protected by a 40% tariff. You couldn't import wine into New Zealand without paying a 40% tariff on it. The industry was in a mess. We had a wine lake. We couldn't drink enough wine to drink the wine being produced. You couldn't export it because it was plonk. And to the credit of the Labour government back in the mid-80s, they wiped the tariffs on imported wine, gave a little bit of transitional help to the wine industry to pull out those cheap Muller-Thurgau grapes and put in some decent Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Sauv Blanc and that sort of thing. And now we command the highest average price for wine on the London market of any country, including France. And our third biggest export to Australia is now wine. And Australia's a big wine producing country. So things, this notion you get swamped is nonsense. What we want is trade access so we, with our clever, good products, can succeed. And that's what it's all about, being clever and having good product. And tariffs, barriers to trade kill that. They don't allow you to be clever. They don't allow you to do things well. And our wine industry is a classic example of what can be done. It's just gone up exponentially. It's gone up just progressively ever since the tariffs were wiped, protecting the New Zealand wine industry.
As I talk to you, I get the sense that you're actually quite proud of our little country.
Oh yeah, I'm very proud of New Zealand. As Trade Minister, I've travelled much of the world, representing New Zealand. And my goodness, I've seen the places people live in, and we are so lucky. This country is such a beautiful country, and we have such freedoms here we've got the longest continuous democracy, I think, of any country in the world, if you count all people voting part of that. And so we enjoy many more freedoms. We have a beautiful country. It makes me sad when people run our country down, because we are a great little country.
When you get to London, what do you think you will be bringing to that role? Because you've had so many roles in New Zealand life. there won't be many of our ambassadors who've done as many things as you have.
I guess, I mean, we've had some very good High Commissioners there and very good ones. And I think where I have a little advantage is the combination of having been the Speaker of the New Zealand Parliament and means that I can perhaps open doors that a career diplomat would struggle with. I know the Speaker of the House of Commons, I know the Speaker of the House of Lords personally, I know the Clerk of the House personally. He invited me to a party at his place when I was last in London. He's married to a woman who grew up only 6 kilometres from here. and so I've got good contacts having been Speaker, but also having been Trade Minister for New Zealand means I have a bit of a reputation too. And I think that's quite useful. I'm familiar with so many of those things. I think where I've got a lot to learn is in the whole sort of security area. New Zealand's very intimately involved with the Western world in security and concerns about terrorism and that kind of thing. And that's an area that I've not been so heavily involved in. That'll be a bit of a learning area for me.
30 years, near enough, in Parliament. You must be sad to leave it.
Yes and no. I'm ready to go. You know, to me it's so important to know when you've done all you can do. There are still things I'd love to do. I'd love to be involved in negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's stuff in education I'd still love to have done. There's all sorts of things I'd love to have done. But it's so important to know when you've done all you can sensibly do and know when to go. I've seen too many politicians stay around too long, and I didn't want to do that. I've been privileged to be able to go at a time of my choosing on a reasonable high.
It has been a pleasure to talk to you, Dr. Smith. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Allan Lee talking there with Dr. the Right Honourable Sir Lockwood Smith just before he left for London to officially take up his position as New Zealand's High Commissioner. And that's our programme for this week. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Ka kite, God bless you.